Continuing where we left off, we talked about the contrast node previously, and the next one I was mentioning that we're going to start talking about these remappers. Now, for the remapper, these are usually considered as some sort of a hue, saturation, and value adjustment tool. It essentially allows us to control these textures via a set of graphs, and then each graph essentially indicates the hue, the saturation, and the value. So let's get started with it. I'm just going to move these guys off a bit to the side, and I'm going to take my first texture and connect that to the out color. Now, as we talked about in the first lesson, we specifically said that the red, green, and blue channels are essentially a cluster of RGB information, and then these remap type of nodes, they have the same kind of thing. We have red, green, and blue. So anywhere where you have a direct correlation where both nodes have an RGB channel, then the information going from the out color to the color will be a consistent connection without any connection editor popping up and asking you to connect that. From here, I'm going to drag my out color to my color on my shader, and then we can see the information is currently just passing through that, going straight into our shader with the result as we see here. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to grab my, let's say, the value slider at the bottom, and you'll see there's two little dots. These essentially represent the low end and the high end, or the shadows and the highlights value of our particular colors on the original file node. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this little arrow on the side, and that will expand a view for us where we can actually see an extraction of that panel, and we can resize this if you want to. We can make it longer and so on and so forth. We can change the interpolation types if you want to have these curves to be a nice smooth blend, but at the moment I'm going to leave it at linear as is. I'm going to grab my high end points, and I'm going to just move this off to the side so we can have a look at our shadable. I'm going to bring this down, and as I do that, you can see that we are currently dropping the overall value of our original image. We can also introduce an additional point in between, or multiple points for that matter, and we can clamp these values to add more contrast and spike these values a little bit more, and then that means we're getting a much more contrasted look like we did with the contrast node. So I'm going to get rid of these guys by clicking on these little X's, and I'm going to close this window and jump to the next one. Let's look at the saturation. I'm going to click on that guy, bring that up, and let's see if we drop this. As we drop this down, we can see we're just desaturating the image. So going all the way to 0, we have completely desaturated the texture, and we still have all the values from our original texture, but we have desaturated it. Let's quickly have a look at how we can do this inside of Photoshop. I'm going to go to Photoshop. We'll bring this guy into view, get rid of our old exposure node, and we're going to introduce a layer adjustment and hue and saturation. So with the hue and saturation, we have exactly the same kind of layout. If we brought the highlights up, we can make the whole image brighter or darker. Unfortunately, we do not have control to add additional points in between to clamp these values, but we can go and control the separate channels if we wanted to. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my saturation slider, and you can see if I bring that all the way down to -100, we have essentially desaturated the whole image like we saw in Photoshop. Inside of Maya. So I'm going to bring this back up again, and if we change the hue, we can actually see that we're changing the color scheme of our image, and we can remap the ranges of the colors that we initially had to a different set of range a different set of colors for that matter. So back in Maya, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I can go and change the colors just by changing the slide over here. We can also introduce an additional point or two if you wanted to clamp some of these to give it a different kind of way that the hue values will be clamped together. So it's quite nice. I think this node is really useful if you want to, instead of going into Photoshop and saving out your color as a different, say from red to green, then we can rather do that inside of Maya on the fly without needing to reopen the original file node and continue from there. So that's essentially the remap HSV. The remap HSV, I find it's great, especially if you're more comfortable working with the hue saturation and value instead of RGB. But let's quickly have a look at the colors remapper and see how that differs from our HSV node. If we look at the HSV, like I said, it's hue, saturation, and value. And then on the color remapper, we have separate red, green, and blue. So that's pretty much exactly the same kind of thing. The only difference is you're controlling each channel independently of each other. And if you wanted to desaturate the whole thing, then you have to get these values to pretty much be exactly on the same range. And that will go ahead and make sure that the texture itself is being remapped to a new range. So let's bring these back up again, connect that to our texture, drag that into there, and out color goes to color on the side. Let's try again. There we go. Awesome. So if we were to look at this, if I were to introduce more red, we can see that areas of gray will have some tint of that color. In fact, let's, instead of using this file node of the gradient ramp, I'm going to connect this to our texture and see how that works. So there we go, that's much better. Zoom in a bit. You can see as I do that, I can introduce more red. Depending on wherever your graph is, we can really amp up the contrast between those colors. If I want to add a bit of green, I can do that, and if I want to subtract a little blue, I can do that as well. Right, so that's the difference between these two nodes, and they essentially just allow us to color remap the ranges either via the HSV node or the color node. The next one is a color remapper, but it does it in a grayscale way. So if we were to take this and take that into our input value, you can see by default it's going to give you a little error saying there's no way for you to connect that. And the only way you can really do that is if we take a single channel, either from the red, the green, or the blue channel, and then pipe that into the input value, because simply the input value is using a float value instead of a separate RGB channel. Now to do this, you can either choose to take the red channel, but we have to be very careful with this because the red channel looks completely different to the green channel and completely different to the blue channel. So we have to pick the right map or the right channel that we would like to remap for the values to change. And once it's been remapped, it essentially keeps it as a grayscale map, and so the output result will naturally be just a simple grayscale channel. If we were to take these over here, you can see now it's completely desaturated. We took the colors from the blue channel through the inputs. We can then remap those colors, and the output result is a grayscale version of the blue channel. If you wanted to have the resulting value of the red, green, and blue, we will have to put a node in between here that will compress these values together so that the result that goes into the input value on the remap is the combined values, and we can do that via placing a simple luminance value in between. I will address that at some point, not in this particular video. I'll show you guys how we can do that later on. So just really looking at the different types of remap nodes, going from the top again, this guy simply allows us to change the values based on the hue, saturation, and value independently. The remapper on the color allows us to remap the values separate for the red, separate for the green, and separate for the blue. And lastly, the remap value is a way for us to convert those initial colors from the file node into a set of grayscale values that can be remapped and changed to have more contrast, so that the resulting output is gray and contrasted. In the next video, we will start looking at some of the more intricate type of nodes, like the sampler info node and the gamma correction node. These are definitely a way for us to push the range of colors based on the normals of the object, and they also allow us to really be able to contrast the textures in a way that we haven't done before. So see you guys in the next one. Cheers.